The evidence doesn't lie. So what is reasonable? That was the first thing you heard from us today, members of the jury. Because it's what we want you to do. Examine the evidence and determine what is reasonable. You saw that in today's case, the only reasonable explanation is that the defendant was intentionally involved in a scheme to defraud. In a case like this, it's hard to see who the real victim is. She had the money to pay, and her daughter got into college. The real victims are all the kids across the country who spent their life dreaming of getting into Berkeley, who spent their high school careers working and studying hard and actually being varsity golf captains to get passed up for Jewel, who put on her resume, "I have the most Instagram followers in my school." Now, whether Jewel deserved to get into Berkeley or not, we'll never know, because her mother took it upon herself to be above the rules, because she used her vast wealth and influence to push aside the hardworking, deserving kids. And I want to make it clear to you right off the bat that this is a circumstantial case. You see, you don't walk up to someone and say, "Hey, I want you to bribe my kid's way into college." You especially don't put that in writing. But what defense won't tell you, and despite what you may hear on TV, direct and circumstantial evidence bear the same weight in a court of law. This means you can examine the evidence as a whole, and if you see a clear picture, well, then you know what happened. So let's talk more about what that means we had to prove. Because we charged the defendant with fraud, that means we must prove 3 things beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt, that's the highest burden in our judicial system. Beyond any doubt, that is reasonable. We welcome that burden. We wouldn't have it any other way. So this means we had to prove that 1, Meltam was involved in a scheme to defraud. 2, she was involved intentionally. And 3, that scheme used wire communication. I want to talk about that 3rd point first. Because wire communication, it sounds complicated. But what it really means is any exchanges of information, series of communication that take place over a wire-based technology. And that includes cell phone and internet, so text messages, phone calls, emails, that's all wire communication. Because of the nature of this case, if you believe that Meltam acted with intent to defraud, well, this was her method of doing so. So we can agree that that 3rd step is clear. If you believe she acted with intent to defraud, she did so using wire communication. So let's talk about the other 2 points. First, that she was involved in a scheme. Now, Spencer Matthew took the stand, and he told you all about his business, Reach for the Stars. How it had 2 parts. The one legitimate tutoring aspect, and that accounted for 5% of the profit, and the other underground illegal fraudulent side. This was the man that Meltam contacted about getting her daughter into college. She said, "My daughter's applying to colleges. I hear you are the one to come to about this. Can you help me?" And help her he did. You heard how he took her from a 1080 on the PSATs, bribed his psychologist to get her into a different test center, artificially inflated those scores to a 1480, and then turned her into a golf star. How he bribed coaches to let her in and gave her an entire new career in golf as varsity captain with several tournament wins. It's an entire paragraph addition on that resume. And he did this all at the direction of Meltam. You see, she paid $10,000 for consulting and $140,000 to charity to dissuade suspicion. You see, despite what the defense will tell you, she was involved. Because after I'm done here, they're going to come up and they're going to say that you shouldn't trust Mr. Spencer. And when they say this, they're trying to confuse you. Because yes, Mr. Spencer, he's here on a plea deal. But that plea deal is to testify against all the people involved in this scheme, not to testify against one Meltam. And you heard on cross-examination that if he lies during his testimony, well, that plea deal disappears. Mr. Matthews' business is horrible. We're not asking you to think that he's a good guy or a reputable businessman. He's going to jail for this too. But with all he had riding on honesty, it's not reasonable for him to be untruthful. And even if it was, members of the jury, it's not just his testimony that you have to rely on. Look at the evidence, because the evidence doesn't lie. Examine all those phone calls and the exchanges of information that show this process took place. You heard today that bribes, well, they're expensive. Mr. Matthew Spencer, he's an intelligent guy. So ask yourselves, members of the jury, why would he go through this entire process of shelling out those bribes and taking that huge pay cut when he could have just tutored her daughter normally, let her fail at getting into college, and taken that full $150,000 for himself? Because Meltam was in on the scheme. Because he explained what his business could do, and she wanted him to do it for her, which brings us to our second point, intent. That Meltam was intentionally involved in this scheme. Because once again, after I'm done, Mr. Mauser, he's going to come up before you, and he's going to tell you that she gave this money to charity, not knowing the inner workings. But when you examine the evidence, you see that that's not reasonable. First, I want you to take a look at that resume. Golf team, in big bold. It's an entire paragraph edition of the resume. You heard that Meltam was a very involved mother. That she was basically a helicopter parent. She went to every extracurricular activity and was very, very involved in the application process. But when asked, well, you didn't see that resume? She said, oh no. The one package of the admissions thing, well, that's the one piece that she chose to not see. Instead, she says, Mr. Spencer, well, somehow he must have submitted that resume. The judge asked you to leave a lot of things at the door today, members of the jury. He asked you to leave your biases. He asked you to leave your prejudices, your preconceived notions, but he didn't ask you to leave your common sense. That's because it's crucial. You rely on your common sense and lived experience to determine what is reasonable. And if your common sense is telling you it's not reasonable for an outside person to access Jules' direct communication with the school and submit her resume for her unseen and unsigned off on by parent or child, you can listen to your common sense. Because there's one more thing I want to talk about, and it's something that Meltam herself told you. She told it to you in an interview, where she said, I would never pay $100,000 for admissions consulting. I know that real consulting doesn't cost more than $10,000 or $15,000. And she's right, members of the jury. But $10,000 or $15,000, that's 15000. 5 figures. I want you to look at the email where she reached out to Mr. Spencer, because she agreed to pay 6 figures. 150,000, $150,000. She knew, and she paid those 6 figures. Paid to get her daughter into a better college. Paid to push aside the hardworking, deserving kids. Paid because she thought she was better, and paid because she could. Show Meltam that this is not okay. That there are things in life that can't or shouldn't be bought. We proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Meltam was intentionally involved in a scheme to defraud. Look at the evidence, examine what is reasonable, because the evidence doesn't lie. People do. So find in favor of the prosecution and find Meltam guilty of fraud. Thank you.